So if they asked you to be on standby, make weight for that welterweight title fight, would you do it?
I'd say stand by on this, bitch.
So suffice to say a no is the way you would treat that. All right,
so obviously the big story right now is that a UFC title fight at welterweight was finally announced for UFC 235. It will be between Tyron Woodley and Kamaru Usman, not Colby Covington. Now, obviously, Colby Covington won the interim title back in Chicago back in June at UFC 225 by defeating Rafael dos Anjos. After that fight, according to him, he then talked to the UFC, told them that he had a sinus issue that he had to take care of, would be available in November, which is about 4 months after the previous fight with RDA. And then from there would be able to unify the belts. So in that time frame, there was an event that the UFC had scheduled that was in September that they were looking for main events for and were unable to find a main event for. So they started to get a little bit desperate, tried to force a UFC welterweight title fight in there, which of course would then be Woodley versus Colby Covington. But at the time, Covington had already told them, hey, look, I'm getting my sinus surgery. It was a necessary surgery for him to help him breathe, something that he'd been putting off for a while, something that the UFC doctors agreed needed to happen. And the UFC took issue with that because they felt like he was being difficult, and in an opportunity where that he could have really saved the show there, he didn't step up. So in the end, instead, Darren Till got the title shot. Dana White went out and said that Covington was stripped of his interim title. Now, whether or not they actually stuck to that, kind of hard to say. White seemed to kind of pretend after the fight that Covington still was the interim champ. That would be the fight. That would make sense afterwards. But then in November, which was going to be the next opportunity at Madison Square Garden when they were really in need of a main event again, this time around, Tyron Woodley was unable to make that date because he had his own injuries to deal with. In the end, the Daniel Cormier versus Derek Lewis fight ended up headlining that card. So then they look again in January. And again, in January, Tyron Woodley versus Colby Covington is supposed to be a fight that's happening then. Again, Tyron Woodley's not available. This led to Dana going out and saying, when does Tyron ever accept a fight? Right after he accepted a fight in September. So obviously, it seemed like there was some annoyance on his part because he wanted the fight in November. He wanted the fight in January, and Tyron didn't accept either date. So then at that point, they were looking to see, well, what else can they do to save the card? So they offered Covington a fight against Kamaru Usman, and Covington declined that because he only wants to take the Tyron Woodley fight at this time. In the end, they couldn't find another fight, whereas before they found the Lewis versus Cormier fight, this time they didn't find any fight. So they ended up having to cancel the entire event, and that wasn't something that the UFC took lightly. It wasn't something they were happy about. And if you look at both Woodley and Covington, both of them got underneath the UFC skin, but obviously Woodley's the actual champion, so what they can do with him as far as screwing him over is kind of limited versus what they can do with Covington, especially when they had already said that Covington's interim title didn't matter anymore. At that point, Kamaru Usman also had a very nice win over RDA in November, and after a long time of Dana White saying that he didn't really care for Kamaru Usman, didn't like his 30% comment and so on, one nice performance, and all of a sudden Usman's looking pretty good in his eyes, especially since Usman accepted a fight against Covington at the later to be canceled event. So in the end, Dana White pretty upset with Colby Covington, happy with Usman for getting a lot of the same wins that Covington has and being more willing to fight, decides to give Kamaru Usman the fight. So I'm going to play a couple other clips. Both of these clips come from, I guess the clips come from two shows. One of the shows is Ariel Helwani's MMA show that Colby Covington was on, and the other one comes from the MMA Hour hosted by Luke Thomas. So I'm going to go back to Ariel Helwani's show right now. And this is going to be Colby Covington explaining what he thinks happened in his words.
In the end, why didn't you get the title shot?
In the end, I didn't get the title shot because, politics behind, you wanted to pull the curtain back today, so we're pulling back the curtain, Dana White, he's lied to me. The UFC, they've lied to me. They made promises to me that, I was going to fight Tyron Woodley in November at Madison Square Garden. They made promises I was going to fight him in January in California. And then all of a sudden I'm getting passed up for a guy behind me that's beating my sloppy seconds. It's not even a guy that the fans want to see. If anything, Dana and the UFC, they're on the fans. I mean, you did a poll. 75,000 people voted. 80% of the people wanted me to fight Tyron Woodley. I mean, there was a bunch of other polls on MMA Junkie. Tyron Woodley did a poll. I mean, Tyron Woodley was out there begging for me to fight. I almost feel bad for Tyron Woodley now. He's like 0 for 6 in fights he's trying to call. So, but we also found out that Tyron Woodley has no power. So, it's just business for me. Business goes on as usual. I'll just keep getting better here at American Top Team, and there's not a man alive that can beat me. So I'm not really too worried.
So why do you think the UFC and Dana White lied to you?
Why do I think what?
The UFC and Dana White lied to you, as you just said.
I'm not sure. I've done everything they've asked me to do. I've flown over to countries. I went to Australia and sold their show, and they never even paid me.
Yeah, and it kind of goes on
there.
from here. And also play another clip from the Luke Thomas interview. That gets a little bit more detailed. When he talks about politics, it sounds like he's referring to Ali Abdelaziz here. So I'll play a clip where he kind of talks about that more specifically.
To go, and especially when the number one fighter has a belt, and the number one fighter went to the White House. So, and the number one fighter does the biggest numbers and is the biggest draw. So, this is a direct result of his manager. He's sucking the UFC off, and the UFC likes that, so they're going to do him favors.
Well, it was, I believe, reported by my colleague Ariel Helwani that the reason why they went in a different direction was they just didn't like the fact that you were saying no to anybody but Woodley. And so because Usman was fighting anyone at any time, they said, well, this guy's more accommodating. He also has been, climbing his way through the ranks. Let's just go in that direction. Is that what you had heard at all?
This is what I say to that. No one, I haven't heard anything like that. They can say whatever they want. They're just trying to feed the media and the people something because they don't have anything. They can't give them anything, Luke. They can't say because he's a bigger draw, because of this or that, because he's not. He's not a bigger draw. Everybody wants to see me fight Woodley. No one cares about him. They only care about him when he's talking about me. Otherwise, he can't draw 20 comments. No one cares. No one's engaged or interacting with him because the fans just don't care. He's a liar. I'm a man of my word. I'm truthful. Everything I say has been honest, man. I always keep it real, and maybe that's why the UFC doesn't like me because I keep it real, and they like the shady people, the people that lie to them and that. But I'm not that guy. I'm a trustful guy. I'm a man of my word, and when you give me your word, I'm going to hold you to your word.
You mentioned the surgery and that you had.
Yeah, that wasn't the clip on Ali, but the point that he made with Ali is that he thinks that Ali has some shady dealings with the UFC, that he thinks that Ali has some kind of leverage with them. And because Usman is one of Ali's fighters, that there was a favor that they had paid off to Ali that was just kind of saying, hey, look, we owe you a favor. We'll give you the Usman fight. Whether or not that's actually the case, I don't know. I don't know what would be in the UFC's interest to give Usman the title fight just because of Ali owing them a favor. The question would be, what sort of favor are they playing? Is Ali saying, hey, we'll give you one fight if you give us this fight? One of the things I read online is that if Ali took this opportunity, or the deal here was that if Ali can get Khabib to fight Tony Ferguson, then they'll take this fight with Kamaru Usman. I don't know that makes any sense to them. If you're talking about Khabib, I think you want to give him the fight that makes the most money. I guess Conor might be that guy right now, but it makes most sense for Conor to get a win before he goes back to Khabib to kind of get the most out of the rematch. So right now, the fight that makes the most sense regardless, I think, is Tony for Khabib. But either way, as far as what I think really happened here, from Colby's standpoint, and I guess really from the UFC standpoint, usually if someone's being difficult with them, I think a good recent example would be Brian Ortega, in that Brian Ortega had a fight lineup with Max Holloway. Max Holloway has that bizarre incident where possibly he was poisoned. Who knows what happened exactly? Maybe it was just an issue with the weight cut. Ortega does not accept a fight on late notice for an interim title against Jeremy Stevens. And as a result, he ends up not even getting paid for the event, not even getting paid for all the work he did leading up to it. Eventually, he gets some money out of it. But in the end, the fans still really wanted that fight, so they made the fight anyway. So again, Holloway versus Ortega finally happens. And then, of course, Holloway got the win there. So you would think that there's some similarities here where Colby wasn't willing to take a fight on... It's not the same type of short notice. It's not like it's a couple days, but it's still relatively short notice. He wasn't willing to take the fight. He felt that he had earned a spot as a top contender. And they didn't really seem to honor that. So the question is, why did Ortega get the chance, and why is Covington getting passed over? What exactly do they think of Colby Covington from the UFC standpoint that they didn't seem to see in Brian Ortega? And I kind of have my beliefs on that, my kind of guesses. I guess the first thing I would say is that the Covington versus Woodley fight is not as big in their mind as it is in our fans' minds. And as far as where I stand on that argument, I can kind of understand both sides. Obviously, the Covington versus RDA fight was a co-main event fight that co-headlined with Yoel Romero and Robert Whitaker. And if the UFC got numbers back on that after a lot of promotion from Colby Covington for that fight, and they felt like the numbers weren't that great, then they may be under the impression, and possibly rightfully so, that Colby Covington really isn't the draw that he seems like he could possibly be. It's not like he has a gigantic social media following, though he is fairly active there. And so from their standpoint, they could be saying, hey, look, I know people might think that it's going to draw just because Colby Covington's stirring up a lot of shit, but the numbers don't seem to bear that out. Now, with that being said, if you look at this specific fight, Colby versus Tyron, this is a fight that's been getting worked on for quite a while. It's a fight that both of them have been talking about for quite a while. It's got that aspect that you don't see fairly often in the UFC, where you have two guys who used to train together, and you kind of have a sort of like a similar backstory that you have with the Cody versus TJ situation. You have a guy in Tyron who's fairly vocal about being against Trump. You have obviously Colby, who's a huge Trump supporter, so there could be a storyline there that might be able to transcend just the MMA media and sort of gain more attention, potentially bring more eyes to that fight. So to me, I think it's pretty fair to say that the Covington versus Woodley fight is going to do more than the Usman versus Woodley fight. The other thing that I think may factor in here is that if Colby is dead set on being the champion or being the interim champion, and he said in the interviews here that he hasn't really made money an issue of it, but then on another token, he'll then say that they should pay him a lot of money. So it's kind of hard to tell where he stands on this. But you get the feeling that since he didn't win the interim belt, there may be some pay-per-view points that are on the line there. So for that 235 card, you have John Jones, who's going to be getting pay-per-view points. You have Tyron Woodley, who's going to be getting pay-per-view points. And if you have Colby Covington also getting pay-per-view points versus Kamaru Usman, who will not be getting pay-per-view points, the UFC may have looked at it from that standpoint and said, hey, we might be taking a few less buys by putting Usman in here, but maybe that ends up saving us some money in the long run because we're not paying up points to 3 different fighters. Instead, we're paying out to 2. So that's another option there. From what the UFC has been saying, their issue with Colby is that he's just not taking fights, which the fights that he wasn't taking would have been the fight in September, which there's no reasonable expectation for him to take that fight, and the UFC doctor has agreed with that. And then the fight in January against Kamaru Usman after Woodley said that he wasn't able to show because Covington felt that he had the spot in line, and there was no reason for him to give up that spot in line and risk it for nothing. That the UFC wasn't going to, just because he does a favor for the UFC is not going to pay him back. And that's a pretty fair statement to make. I mean, we just talked about the Brian Ortega situation. There was a Max Holloway versus Frankie Edgar fight that was initially supposed to happen. Now, Frankie Edgar, unlike Ortega, said, yes, I will take on a new challenger. They brought Brian Ortega in. Ortega defeats Edgar. And now Frankie Edgar, even after getting a win over Cub Swanson in his return fight, it's not as though he's got his spot back in line because he did the UFC a favor by staying on the card and giving them a pretty solid co-main event. Or I think that may have actually been the main event on that card. So it's true at this point, the UFC has done a very poor job of actually living up to, I don't know if you would call it a deal exactly. It's not like they have anything signed, but living up to sort of implied arrangements that if you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours. So I don't blame Colby Covington for not scratching the UFC's back. In the case of the Anaheim event that got canceled, that would have been the 26th of January. Beyond that, he's saying he's not going to take any other fights moving forward that aren't title fights. Hopefully, the fight between Woodley and Usman ends with one winner winning dominantly and not taking too much damage. Now, obviously, that kind of was what happened with the Till versus Woodley fight, but even with Woodley taking only a couple shots and winning fairly dominantly, he still had some injuries that had to be healed up. So hopefully there's a pretty good training camp for both those Usman and Woodley. Neither of them are too injured going into the fight. Neither of them get injured coming out of the fight, or at least the winner doesn't get injured. And Colby can finally get back in the title picture and get back to being active. Because I think, while it's hard to say that Colby's ever going to be a star, I don't know that that's the case. I think he's got a troll quality to him where, sort of like in the way that Tito Ortiz was really obnoxious and a lot of people just want to see him lose, I think Colby can eventually get into that spot where a lot of people want to see him lose if he keeps winning. And for him at 30 years old, you hate to see someone in their athletic prime just kind of sitting by and letting issues with the company or contract negotiations get in the way of their career. So hopefully the fight happens in March, or maybe even better for him, maybe Kamaru Usman gets injured right now, has to pull out of the fight, and the UFC's like, you know what, fuck it, we screwed up. We'll put you back in there, and we get the Colby versus Woodley fight in May or in March, but I wouldn't count on that. But either way, hopefully we get to see Colby back soon. Hopefully this all gets sorted out. He was talking about if he doesn't get to fight for the UFC title, that maybe they can just release him and he can fight someone like Rory McDonald in Bellator. I'd be interested in watching that. But again, there aren't a whole ton of fights for him in Bellator. I think there are a lot more fights for him in the UFC. So to have this issue here, it kind of bugs me. Colby's a guy, I can understand if you hate Colby, if you feel like he's a troll, if you feel like this Trump shit is something that you don't enjoy at all. But for me, for a while, I hated Colby because one thing that bugs me more than anything in the UFC is when fighters see someone else who talks shit get attention, they kind of make the assumption in their head, oh, I also need to talk shit to get attention, even if they suck at it. And Colby hasn't really been very good at talking shit. But he's sort of like gone from like being this guy who's just like a tryhard to like being a guy who's starting to like just troll people and get under their skin and do things that annoy people. And by picking up the whole Trump gimmick, whether he actually likes Trump in his personal life or not, by picking up that public gimmick at least, just the attention he's gotten for it, I think has been pretty good for him. I think the next fight that he has after it, and again, he visited the White House after the RDA fight, so we haven't really seen what he can draw after the visit to the White House. We haven't seen what he can draw when there's a promo of him standing there with Donald Trump. So it'll be interesting to see once he comes back. I hope he comes back in the UFC. I hope he comes back in a title fight. And from there, hopefully everything gets soothed over and this is just an issue of the past. But to end the video, I'll play the clip that I meant to play earlier. That was just Colby talking directly about Ali Abdelaziz. So I'll play through that and then end the video after that.
You mentioned that Usman has a powerful manager. He does. It's Ali Abdelaziz, who's a very powerful manager, very successful manager. Do you believe that he just has a better relationship with Dana than Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. Ali is a little dirty rat, and he has done some things for the UFC that they owe him favors. So that's the only reason this fight's coming together. This has nothing to do with snoozing. This has everything to do with his manager. In no way, shape, or form is there ever a time where you put the number 2 fighter above the number 1 fighter when the number 1 fighter is ready to go. And especially when the number 1 fighter has a belt and the number 1 fighter went to the White House. So, and the number 1 fighter does the biggest numbers and is the biggest draw. So, this is a direct result of his manager. He's sucking the UFC off, and the UFC likes that. So they're going to do him favors.